Sunshine Skyway freighter strike. On May 9, 1980, on the southbound span of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge over Tampa Bay near St. Petersburg, Florida, a violent squall rolled in off the water just after 7:30 in the morning. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and wind gusts pushed past 50 miles an hour. A Greyhound bus carrying 26 passengers, 6 cars, and a Ford Courier pickup were crossing the span, more than 150 feet above the bay. Behind the wheel of the pickup was Wesley McIntyre, on his way to a meat delivery job. Below the bridge, the inbound freighter Summit Venture, weighing nearly 20,000 tons, had lost sight of the structure in the storm. The harbor pilot guiding the ship couldn't make out the channel markers ahead of him. The freighter drove straight into a support column. Roughly 1,200 feet of the southbound span tore loose and fell away. The bus, the cars, and McIntyre's pickup plunged toward the water. His truck struck the deck of the ship as it dropped, then hit the bay. 35 people died, 26 of them aboard the Greyhound bus. McIntyre forced his way out of the cab underwater and surfaced beside the freighter, where the crew pulled him aboard. He was the only person who went off the bridge that morning and lived. The Greyhound bus had dropped 150 feet into the bay with no time for anyone aboard to react. Rescue boats searched the gray water for hours, working beneath the broken end of the span that now hung over the channel. The harbor pilot, John Larrow, was cleared of wrongdoing by both a Coast Guard inquiry and a grand jury, which placed the cause on the sudden storm. Larrow carried the disaster with him for the rest of his life, and many came to call him the 36th victim. A new Sunshine Skyway Bridge opened in 1987, built taller and set in a better protected channel. Engineers ringed its piers with massive concrete bumpers called dolphins, designed to absorb the blow of any ship that ever lost its way again. Interstate 35W gusset plates. On August 1, 2007, at 5 minutes past 6 in the evening, the Interstate 35W bridge carried rush hour traffic across the Mississippi River in the heart of Minneapolis, Minnesota. 4 of the bridge's 8 lanes were closed for resurfacing, and a construction crew was working on the deck. Sherry Engebretson, 60 years old, a marketing director at Thrivent Financial, was driving home from her downtown office in her Mercedes. It was a route she normally avoided because she disliked the constant construction delays on that stretch of highway. Without warning, the central span of the steel truss bridge buckled and dropped toward the river. The spans on either side followed, folding into the water and onto the banks below. 111 vehicles were caught in the collapse, along with the crew working on the deck. Engebretson's car fell with the roadway. She was among 13 people killed, and 145 others were injured. Off-duty workers and ordinary bystanders climbed into the wreckage and pulled survivors from cars trapped in the river. A school bus full of children came to rest against the broken structure, and everyone aboard it survived. Federal investigators spent 15 months on the wreckage and found the answer in the gusset plates, the steel pieces that tie the main trusses together. Some were only about half an inch thick, far too thin for the weight the bridge carried. The undersized plates had been a design error written into the original 1960s plans. The National Transportation Safety Board attributed the collapse to that flaw, made fatal by the added weight of the resurfacing materials and equipment stacked on the deck that day. Quebec Bridge ironworkers. On August 29, 1907, at 25 minutes to 6 in the evening, the half-built south arm of the Quebec Bridge reached out over the St. Lawrence River near Quebec City. The shift change whistle had just blown. Dozens of ironworkers were still out on the steel, among them a large crew of Mohawk men from the Ganawage Reserve near Montreal. One of them was Sose O'Ree, 44 years old, married with a family of 11. In the weeks before, deflections had begun to appear in the steel cords. Some of the workers had grown uneasy enough to stay home for a few days, but the work had resumed. As the men gathered their tools to leave, the bridge let out a sudden, violent shudder. The entire south section folded and dropped into the river. Of the 86 men on the structure, only 11 came out alive. 75 workers died, 33 of them Mohawk ironworkers from Ganawage. Rescuers worked the water and the tangled steel through the evening, but the bodies of many of the dead were never recovered from the St. Lawrence. A royal commission found the disaster had been caused by a design error in the bridge's compression members, which had been built too weak for the loads they were asked to carry. The warning signs in the bending steel had been noticed and ignored. The loss tore through Ganawage, where 24 of the 33 Mohawk dead had been married, and 4 family names ceased to exist entirely. Many of the men were buried beneath crosses made of steel beams. Schoharie Creek scour failure. On April 5, 1987, the New York State Thruway crossed Schoharie Creek near Fort Hunter in Montgomery County, New York. After record rainfall, the normally shallow creek, usually about 6 feet deep, had swollen to roughly 25 feet, more than 10 feet above flood level. Edward Meyer Jr., 50 years old, a chief gas mechanic for the Niagara Mohawk Power Corporation, was driving home toward Albany from a bowling tournament in Syracuse, crossing the Thruway Bridge with the late morning traffic. Beneath him, the swollen creek was clawing at the soil around the bridge piers, where the protective stone riprap had already washed away. Pier 3 lost its footing and gave way. 2 spans dropped about 80 feet into the churning water, carrying cars and a tractor-trailer down with them. Roughly 90 minutes later, a second pier and a third span collapsed into the creek. 10 people were killed. Rescue crews searched the violent water for days, and the body of the last victim, Edward Meyer Jr., was not recovered until more than 2 years afterward. The National Transportation Safety Board found the probable cause was the New York State Thruway Authority's failure to keep adequate riprap around the piers. That neglect let scour erode the soil out from under the footings. It remains the deadliest bridge failure in New York State history, and it forced sweeping changes to how the nation inspects its bridges for scour. Morbi Machchhu River Bridge. On October 30th, 2022, on a colonial-era pedestrian suspension bridge over the Machchhu River in the town of Morbi in Gujarat, India, an evening crowd had gathered for the Dali and Gujarati New Year holidays. Known locally as the Hanging Bridge, it was a 19th century structure roughly 750 feet long and barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. The bridge had reopened just days earlier, after a long closure for renovation. An estimated 200 people pressed onto the narrow walkway, taking in the holiday evening above the water. Under their combined weight, the bridge began to sway hard from side to side. The suspension cables gave way, and the walkway buckled and dropped toward the river. People fell roughly 30 feet into the Machchhu below. At least 135 people were killed, and more than 180 were injured. Emergency crews and local residents worked through the night, pulling survivors and the dead from the dark water. Officials said the renovated bridge simply could not bear the weight of the crowd allowed onto it. A case was opened against the operator, the Oriva Group, over both the repairs and the number of people let onto the span. 9 people were arrested, including company managers and staff. The collapse became one of India's deadliest structural disasters of the decade, with the company's handling of the renovation and the crowd at the center of the official inquiry. Silver Bridge eyebar 330. On December 15, 1967, at about 5 in the evening, the Silver Bridge over the Ohio River connected Point Pleasant, West Virginia with Canaga, Ohio. Rush hour traffic packed the span, much of it Christmas shoppers, and the deck sat bumper to bumper. Charlene Wood, pregnant and driving home from her job at a hair salon, crept toward the bridge at about 15 miles an hour, the roadway ahead of her jammed with trucks and commuters. She felt the bridge begin to shake. The whole span started to rock beneath the wheels. Wood threw her car into reverse and backed up a short distance before the rocking stalled her engine, leaving her about 4 feet from the edge. Within about a minute, the bridge tore loose and folded into the freezing Ohio River, dragging 32 vehicles down with it. 46 people were killed, and 2 of them were never found. Rescue boats and divers worked the icy water in the dark. Wood, stalled at the very brink, was among those who lived, and 4 months later, she gave birth to twins. Investigators traced the entire collapse to the failure of a single eyebar, the one numbered 330, in one of the suspension chains. A cleavage fracture only about 3 millimeters deep had grown undetected inside that one piece of steel. The bridge had been built with only a single chain on each side. When that one eyebar let go, there was no second chain to carry the load, and the entire span unzipped in seconds. There had been no margin for failure built into the design at all. The disaster pushed the United States to create its first national bridge inspection standards, requiring the country's bridges to be regularly inspected for the very first time. Francis Scott Key Bridge, Dali strike. On March 26, 2024, at about 1:30 in the morning, the Francis Scott Key Bridge carried Interstate 695 over the Patapsco River at the mouth of Baltimore Harbor in Maryland. Out in the channel, the container ship Dali was leaving port, bound for sea. On the bridge deck overhead, a crew of highway workers was filling potholes through the overnight hours, the quiet shift when the road carried almost no traffic. Among them was Miguel Luna, a father who had come to Maryland from El Salvador, working alongside men who had made the same journey from Central America. Down in the channel, the Dali lost electrical power. Its lights flickered out, and the darkened ship began to drift off course, swinging toward one of the bridge's support piers. The ship struck the pier head-on. Within seconds, the central spans of the key bridge broke apart and fell into the cold river. The construction crew went into the water with the roadway. 6 of the workers were killed. One member of the crew, Julio Cervantes, survived after falling from the bridge and was pulled from the river alive. Coast Guard and local crews searched the Patapsco for days, recovering the bodies of the 6 workers from the submerged wreckage. Federal prosecutors later charged the operator of the Dali, alleging the ship had gone to sea with electrical problems its operators already knew about. Attorneys for the families said the bridge crew was never warned the ship was bearing down on them. The families of several of the victims settled their lawsuit against the ship's owner and operator. The disaster forced a national review of how major bridges over shipping channels are protected from a ship that loses control. The next pothole on the crew's work order was never filled. The whole bridge was gone by sunrise. Cypress Street Viaduct collapse. On October 17, 1989, at about 5 in the evening, the Cypress Street Viaduct carried Interstate 880 through West Oakland, California, on a double-deck stretch of freeway more than a mile long. The evening commute was lighter than usual because much of the Bay Area had stayed near a television to watch the World Series game about to begin across the bay. Buck Helm, 58 years old, a longshoreman, was driving the lower deck of the viaduct in his car. At about 4 minutes past 5, the Loma Prieta earthquake struck. The upper deck of the viaduct broke from its supports and dropped onto the lower deck below. More than a mile of the top roadway pancaked down onto the cars beneath it, crushing them and the people inside. 42 people were killed, most of them caught on the lower deck in the few seconds it took the concrete to fall. Rescue crews spent days tunneling through the collapsed slabs, listening for any sign of life in the wreckage. About 90 hours after the quake, a Caltrans worker found Buck Helm alive, trapped in a car flattened to roughly 3 feet. He was lifted out to cheering rescuers, the last survivor pulled from the structure, though he died about a month later from his injuries. The viaduct's columns had been built before modern seismic standards, and the design left them unable to hold the upper deck when the ground shook. California tore down the surviving sections and rebuilt the route at ground level, away from the double-deck design that had killed so many. If you appreciate documentation like this, consider subscribing, and tell me what to cover next in the comments.